Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 3 and the final day of our 4th Pulmonary Fibrosis Summit. I hope you have all recovered from last night's emotional roller coaster at the 10th anniversary dinner, when we remembered and celebrated all the work that the organization and the many individuals who have pushed for the creation of UPFF did. I hope you all have the same energy that you had last night in the sessions today. Yesterday, we looked at some key topics such as policy, genetics and innovation, drug economics, and gaps in care, looking into CTD, ILD, and ultra-rare forms of pulmonary fibrosis. We also had 2 very, very interactive patient sessions in Dutch and French, and concluded the day with a call to action to push for an early diagnosis, followed by a workshop where we focused on understanding the quality of life burden of caregivers for patients with pulmonary fibrosis. Today, we begin directly hearing from 2 of our industry partners with 2 mini-symposiums, and then we'll talk about something that sits at the center of the work that we do, which is shared decision-making. That means bringing together patients, carers, and healthcare professionals. We are gonna, while you're listening to today's sessions, we actually ask you as well to think about consolidation, direction, and what we can achieve together. Because ultimately, the value of what we're trying to do here is not only the discussions, but as well the connections that you have made, which are very clear when I need to push you all to go back in the room during the coffee breaks. We want to make sure that we carry forward this work in our organization into advocacy, policy, and ultimately the lives of people that live with pulmonary fibrosis. Thank you very much for being part of this summit. We hope that you enjoyed the last day, and we want to thank you as well for all the work that you will continue to do together in the future. We want to make sure that you enjoy the last day. We want to welcome as well our online participants and here early in the morning as well on a Sunday. And I'm going to hand over to the first mini-symposium, and then I'll hand over to Brian as a moderator and the rest of the team. Please, if you want to scan the QR code at the bottom, is for a word cloud, and Brian will tell you a little bit more about it.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on the 3rd day of the Patient Summit. I have the honor today to moderate this panel with my esteemed colleagues here. So, my name is Brian Lee. I'm currently the Senior Director at Bristol Myers Squibb, leading our patient advocacy team for immunology and cardiovascular disease. Been with BMS for 9 years, working in healthcare for the last 2 decades or so, and in advocacy for about 13 years. On my panel today, we have Dimitri, who is my colleague at BMS. He's leading policy and access in Europe at BMS, and his responsibilities include research, position development, engagement on economic and market access and policy issues, including HTA or health technology assessment, as well as pricing, healthcare systems, and pharmaceutical budgets. Next, we have Steve Jones, who likely does not need any introduction. I know many of you, probably all of you know him. He was currently the President Emeritus at EUPFF, very active, continues to be active at Action for Pulmonary Fibrosis in UK, diagnosed with IPF in 2008, and lived with the disease for 8 years before a single lung transplant. Currently leading a lot of our disease awareness campaigns and work within the pulmonary fibrosis community. Lastly, we have Gurley, who also needs no introduction, as I believe this is maybe his 3rd panel at this event. He's currently the policy advisor at EUPFF. He's been active in this community and in the pulmonary hypertension community for quite some time now. He has an active role in the rare respiratory field, and sits on the medical steering committee on the ERN lung, as well as a member of Urologists. So to start today, we're actually going to have a poll from the audience. So if you can take out your phones and scan the QR code, it should take you to a website where we would love to hear from either your perspective, the patient perspective, the caregiver perspective, what the most important treatment outcome you're looking for when gauging the benefit of a therapy. And we will maybe just give you 30 seconds or so, maybe a minute, just to input your response, and we would love to see kind of what rises to the top in terms of what you're really looking for. Can we go to the next slide? Oh. Oh. Can we go to the website that has the word cloud? Yeah, if we can show the word cloud as people are typing in. Oh, perfect. All right. So we can see our quality of life is really rising to the top as what everyone's looking for. We see a few others on here: efficacy, a cure, great tolerability, cough, prolonged life, decrease in dyspnea. Let's see, perfect. This is fantastic. So this is really useful, I think, from patients, caregivers, patient organizations, others in the crowd. We're really seeing that quality of life is the most important part of what the community is looking for in terms of benefit from new treatments that are potentially coming onto the market. So this is really useful, I think, as we prepare our discussion. First, for the first question, really would like to understand from our panelists, what are the different roles that stakeholders play in shaping therapeutic reimbursement and budget allocation decisions, and how do these roles intersect with each other? And maybe we'll start with Dimitri from BMS and then shift over.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Good morning, everyone. So obviously, a pharmaceutical company owns the asset, and so will take care of the preparation of the filing and so on. But what I'd like to highlight is that I've seen a real effort over the past few years to increase the collaboration with patient groups and do it earlier and throughout the life cycle of the medicine. So, of course, I can speak for BMS, but I've seen it in other companies because I sit in our European Trade Association. There's increased involvement of patients from the moment you write the protocols, so essentially the methodology that you're going to follow to demonstrate, hopefully, the effects of the medicine. You involve patients at key decision points throughout the development process. So, for example, we're seeing here quality of life come out as the #1 criteria. Well, that's something you would ask patients with a specific therapeutic area and a specific indication, and you would think with patients on how to measure this quality of life. And then once you get closer to regulatory filing and filing for reimbursement, I think patients have become a real component of a multidisciplinary approach, along with clinical assessment, clinical data, and health economic analysis, as we discussed yesterday within the great session on HTA. So I think it's a collaborative approach. The extent to which all of which is taken into account and valued by HTA bodies is a different question, but we'll get to that.
If it comes to patient roles, and if you are interested in a short response, I would say patient experience, which is actually expected. I cannot emphasize enough that those counterparties we are in negotiation during these procedures are not expert of our disease. However, they are always considering other comparators outside our small world. If you are interested in a more sophisticated or longer response, I can also elaborate on this a little bit. What we see is that the regulators as well as the HTA bodies are rather interested in the unmet needs, people living with specific condition, and they are also interested in the burdens and difficulties patients living currently. So this is the main point where we need to actually input in these proceedings.
Anything to add, Steve?
Yeah, I wasn't going, but I think it's right. If we look at I guess the two leaders in this globally are the Canadian, the CADW it's called, and NICE in the UK, who have really been involving patients for a long time, innovating. I've taken part myself as an patient expert. I've written submissions, but really wanting to hear the patient voice, we think. I'm not convinced they listen to it once they've got it, but we'll maybe come to that later on. So I think we've got to go a lot further. I mean, I've had it put to me by some people, give us some good quotes. You know, patient experience quotes, as if that's the sum total of the way we can describe patient experience. So I agree, we're getting there, we're moving in the right direction, at least in some of the agencies, but I think there's a long way still to go.
Perfect. I think you all bring up very valid points. I mean, our regulators or policymakers are really looking to understand not only the data, but the patient story, the burden, the unmet need. So maybe if you can elaborate on how patient experience data is weighed in the current value frameworks, and how reimbursement recommendations, decisions factor in patient experience data.
You want to start?
Yeah, so I think just carrying on from that last point, you see, I think we get given, say for example with NICE, we're given a pro forma to fill in for patients, usually 7, 8, 9 questions, very good, very precise, ones that really help us respond. We go back and we see if they give us enough notice, we'll consult the patient community to answer those questions. But it just takes you so far. We don't know, there's a complete lack of transparency on how the system works. When they're faced with clinical data, they're faced with hard economic analysis, which they argue about for months during the process of these things. I don't know what account they really take of patient information. I don't think we know that yet. But I think we have to get much better at what we do, and we need to try and make our patient experience data more quantitative, put it more in a format, a research kind of format that the committee will understand. But even then, how do you compare an apple with an orange? And I think we just need to help them do that. So, sorry.
Yeah, to take a step back, I think we need to realize that health technology assessment follows a tradition, a philosophy of evidence-based medicine with a hierarchy of evidence at the top of which you find randomized controlled trials, meta-analyses of randomized controlled trials. That's what they're looking for because they're trying to remove bias. They're trying to be as unbiased as possible. And in a way, there's a tension between this philosophy and individual level patient experience because evidence-based medicine with large data sets caters for the median patient or the average patient. So I think there's a way forward. We need to keep working together to push them to broaden the value definition and take into account patient inputs. In our value dossier preparation, we include patient experience. There's a good publication from 2023 that some BMS colleagues worked on, which reviews 53 HTA guidelines for the notions of value they take into account. And the first good news is that the earlier guidelines take a more progressive or broader approach than the older ones, so it's going in the right direction. And we were talking about caregiver burden, so family spillover in terms of a value definition is one of the most taken into account in about 1/3 of the guidelines. We still have work to do because the extent to which it's actually taken into account in the decision room is another story, and I think you both have been in these rooms. Yeah.
I'm also happy to jump in. So I think what has been already said by Steve, it's very important to emphasize that patients actually in the position to influence such kind of activities. So what we see is that there are many, many good examples, probably we will cover later on that it's clear that even though that the methodology probably not really understandable for patients how the input is weighted, and we might face some transparency issues, we still believe that we have influence on the decision at the end.
Perfect. And I think this is really what the discussion is about. It's the frameworks around health technology assessments and reimbursement decisions are moving in the right direction. We're starting to see countries really kind of factor in, though we're not sure how, take into account input from the patient perspective, the caregiver perspective, and other stakeholders. So as we talk about this, let's narrow down a little bit into the pulmonary fibrosis space. I would love to hear what some of the current policy and advocacy challenges and opportunities are for advancing broader access into the pulmonary fibrosis community and for specifically for pulmonary fibrosis therapies in Europe in this context of input from the patient and caregiver and others.
Yeah, we already heard that it's actually not limited to pulmonary fibrosis. It's even broader challenges we are facing currently, starting from the conflict of interest we already heard, starting from that in many cases still we are struggling to find experts who might fit some of the roles, which actually very difficult. But I think that we are on a good pathway working together with other stakeholders, because it's crucial that patients are involved from the very beginning, from the protocol reviews, so we might even influence from the very beginning those proceedings which might have impact on the market authorization as well as on the health technology assessment. And I think once it comes to learning by example, there are many examples from other areas we can easily learn from. And I think that these are good testaments that once patients are dedicated to the cause, it might be even a game changer. So if we probably look at, for instance, Willy Prado kind of disease, many of you might know it's a genetic disorder, and it is resulting in mental disability. And one of the main symptoms is about obsess about food and so on. And naturally there's a gain weight there and loss of muscle and so on. And there was a new medication, and it's an example from France. And actually the regulator was not convinced that it might contribute to the patients. And the parents were really insisting on that. And at the end, it was real game changer, because at the end, it turned out that once you are treating the hunger of these young patients, they can even more focus on learning and even can change their complete world. There's another example which I think might be interesting to mention, is coming from Ukraine prior to the Russian aggression. And we participated in pulmonary hypertension a little bit, and it was about a clear thumb rule, which there's also lots of criticism about health technology assessment methodologies. And it was about money, naturally. And the assessor came up with the idea that, okay, our idea is that we have such kind of money, and the aim is to treat as many patients as possible. So there was no further consideration. And you need to know that pulmonary hypertension is quite complex, lots of pathways, more than 12 medications are available. So patient organization came back and said that, come on, this is not how it works. So it was also another example which might be something to be considered. And lastly, it's a Hungarian example. Probably it's not very wise talking about ongoing procedures, but it's about reimbursement of oxygen concentrators. And if you might recall, yesterday we talked a bit about this PICO structure. So you're trying to find or identify the population, intervention, and so on. And we thought that if we join our forces with rare diseases like pulmonary hypertension, pulmonary fibrosis, it might be practical. But we were pushed back due to many reasons that, okay, you should not have such kind of population. But we went back and said that, okay, how you try to understand that people are still needing oxygen concentrators. Some of the population is no longer needs because they are actually relying on liquid oxygen at home. Others might be still not in the bad condition, let's call it, in the way that they are in need of. So it's a smaller population, we argued. So they accepted. We went back to the back door and stating that there is room for improvement for this. So I think that there are many examples we can learn from the pulmonary fibrosis community.
I'd just like to repeat a point that we talked about yesterday afternoon. On the part of the HTA agencies, for example, EMA, a great deal of interest in patient involvement, but they tie our hands by saying that the patients that they talk to and involve in the process must never have spoken or been part of anything with a pharmaceutical company. And there's a small, relatively small disease area, a relatively small number of patient advocates who understand the system and can present at that level. Our hands are tied. Of course, we talk all the time to pharma companies. That's part of our philosophy, is that we'll get the greatest change that way. But it means that we find it very difficult to get good patients who really can make meaningful contributions to EMA, because they've already spoken to, all the good ones are already talking to pharma companies. So I think we really need to work together on that. I mean, it's a national, global, European level policy thing we have to influence, and we need to work as both pharma and patient organizations to try and bring some recognition to that. It's I don't know where it comes from. We need to find out. Yeah.
So obviously, the PFF expertise next to me dwarfs mine, so I'll stick to a general comment on policy shaping. Return on investment, I think our patient representative from France, Jean-Michel, said policymakers need to learn to spend money to save money. And I discussed this with a government official from Spain last week, and I asked him, so do return on investment figures in disease areas really convince your finance ministry colleagues? And he said yes. So I'm seeing them being increasingly generated and used, and I think we should rely on them. It's a little blunt to use financial figures, but it does unlock decisions for healthcare.
Any examples to share around maybe what other therapeutic areas have seen in terms of maybe changing decisions? And just, I know you also mentioned the context around resource-constrained environments and healthcare budgets.
Yeah, there's an example from the cardiovascular space that we went through as BMS from 2022. I won't get into the specifics, but although the trial had met its endpoints in this rare cardiac condition, the value was not being recognized because the endpoints were not deemed relevant, especially by the German payer. So what we managed to successfully do is work with patient groups, the patient community, the KOL community, to construct a new endpoint using a questionnaire, working with patients, a new morbidity endpoint complemented with quality of life measurements. And that was successfully, published and validated and accepted as patient relevant by, in this case, Germany. So that was a great success of sort of overturning a decision collaboratively, creatively. But I think what also really drove the success in this case is that there was a true recognition of the unmet medical need by everyone at the table. And this had been achieved, uphill, like before the debate on the specific endpoint. There was recognition that there was a problem to be solved and a real unmet need. So yeah, an example of success, I think.
Perfect. And this is really speaking to, I think, what patients, caregivers, patient organizations can do in terms of engaging with policy and regulatory during the HTA process. So for Gergely and Steve, maybe you can expound on what additional things that the audience, patients, caregivers, patient organizations can do to adequately prepare for HTA processes, engaging with policymakers as more medicines hopefully come into market and come into discussion for the pulmonary fibrosis community.
Yeah. I mean, I think from our point of view, our priority, I think, would be to certainly ensure we have a larger number of trained patient advocates capable of doing this kind of work. And we're now putting a lot of emphasis within EU PFF on research and clinical trials. And we're going to have a group of about 7 or 8 patients working with us on that, and in a way, it's a sort of like a mutual training session, in a sense. And we'll make sure that everybody gets exposure to as many meetings, patient advisory groups, the other places where the discussions are held, to build their confidence and their ability to really take part. It still doesn't solve the EMA problem I mentioned earlier. But we then need to, and this is something together with another pharma company who's put a lot of effort into this, we've been looking at training requirements. If part of what we're talking about is bringing patient experience data as well as good as we can. The qualitative information, the whole, the experience statements, but also where we can, quantifying how many people in the community feel this way or that way about an issue. Given enough time, we can get out there and we can do quick surveys that we can bring into the patient experience data we contribute. But again, we need to educate our partners throughout our network of 23 patient organizations. We need to bring their skill level up so that they're thinking about this in advance, they're training people, and more importantly, they know who their patients are. I mean, I think Action, I don't know if Dan is here and from Action for Pulmonary Fibrosis, but they've done an amazing thing the last couple of years of setting up what they started off with the concept of what do we call them? Research champions. But that's moved into a general involvement network where they've got about 150 people who said, call us anytime you need us. You need us for raising awareness, you need us for research, you need us for talking to NICE. Inform us and we'll come forward if we want to take part. So they can put out an email to all of that group. If they say needed to have 10 people suffering from, I don't know, fibrotic hypersensitivity pneumonitis, for example, you could put it out to the call, you'd get 10 or 15 people coming back. You can have a focus group with that group. That evidence can then be reported into the submission to NICE or to whoever. So I think it's about preparation, training. We've got to get much better at what we do to really contribute to this.
Clearly, there's a responsibility on our end as EU PFF, and I think we should start even working from the very beginning, from the protocol review. Probably there might be some standardization which can be made from our end, how we can measure or even proposing some sub-studies which might help us to better understand the patient experience data, which can be used later on in the market access as well as in the health technology assessment. And I also need to emphasize how important is that we are connected to other diseases. Together with Chantal, we are part of the EU stakeholder network of HTA. So we are having a very nice conversation with other patient organizations who are already working in the new HTA regulation. And we also see the fruits of this work. So I think based on such kind of learned examples, we can provide appropriate resources to our members, as Steve mentioned. So it's a multi-level kind of preparation which is needed, not only on patient and patient expert level, as well as on members level, as well as on EU PFF level.
Yeah, could I just come back? You just tweaked some memory thought to me. Is one of the things I was quite surprised. I used to work in international development. I wrote endless analyses over nearly 40 years. Hardly anything was ever published. And I come into this space, and I realize doctors want to publish, and pharma companies, publish everything immediately you can. And I think, which is very good, and I now find I have my name on about 20 papers. I've actually contributed very little, but my name is there anyway. But what I think we need to do is to recognize that, and as a patient community, make sure that what we do gets published. Because when NICE and people are doing their evaluations, if you have a peer-reviewed article that you can refer to that documents the patient experience, that's better than referring to the endless grey reports we've published, which have been extremely good, but haven't gone out to the public domain. So I think what we're doing with across the pharma group in trying to get this stuff out now is very important. So, yeah.
That's perfect. So I think we've heard a few things. Not only must there be incredibly robust scientific data for the medicine and development, there needs to be coordinated and cohesive patient stories and narratives that's quantified as well as holistic, encompassing patients and caregivers. There must also be understanding of the HTA process so that the patients, carers, patient organizations know when and how to engage with our regulatory authorities and policymakers. And then also the patient groups coming together at the national and regional level to work together. So this is really, really fantastic to hear this. It's quite a bit of work, but I would love to understand how maybe the PF community can come together to really help ensure policy, budgetary, and reimbursement decisions are made in favor of the PF community.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think that we are coming always back to the very same point, and I really like that we have a common platform where it can be discussed. So I think that EUPFF provides an excellent platform how a patient living with pulmonary fibrosis can share their experience as well as expertise. And I really like those kind of activities where we can learn, especially from activities throughout NICE or even the Canadian or the US examples. So I think that such kind of meetings as well as webinars which might help us better understand how we are can achieve our common goals.
I think for me, there's one thing I think we're not very good at. There's a lot of talk yesterday about economic data. We're really bad at economic data within the PF patient community, and we don't have it at our fingertips to use in arguments. But even the basic demographic data, we don't know. You know, so the way we present it, we don't know the numbers of people who live with pulmonary fibrosis. We've got a number of countries that have done more work on this. They start off with a figure of, say, in the UK, 30,000. We're now looking at more than 100,000, probably, when you really try and bring together all of the information. And then when we have an estimate, we don't present it properly. For example, you may have, in a country like the UK, you've got, say, 1 million people living with COPD, 100,000 people living with pulmonary fibrosis. You present it like that, and it appears that COPD is 10 times more than PF. If you express it in terms of deaths per year, you find that PF accounts for between 1 and 1.5% of all deaths, but pulmonary COPD possibly 4 or 5. So COPD is actually only 3 times as many deaths per year as we are, because we live on a cycle of 3 to 5 years. So over a 15-year period, we live and die, if you like, collectively, 4 times, whereas over that 15 years, 1 COPD patient dies. We've got to present the data in a way that makes the decision makers realize how big we are and how much it costs to manage us. You know, when we go in for an exacerbation, that's very heavy-duty spending. We need to be able to quantify that because our exacerbations, again, are generally much worse than those that happen with severe asthma or with COPD. They cost more to the NHS or to health services. So I think we just need to get smarter at what we do. And I think I'm certainly guilty of not having done that and putting the time in to work it out. But that's, I think, something we need to get sorted.
Yeah, fully agree. So as you can learn from Steve, actually, we not only need to influence the brain, but also the heart. I think that might be the main message from our end. And you need to know that IRC, which is the International Respiratory Coalition, provides lots of data. So I'm fully supportive of the idea that we should somehow elaborate. We usually talk about and compare pulmonary fibrosis to cancer, how it is actually happening, but I think it might be also practical to highlight some other rare respiratory diseases, how it's happening, or even more prevalent ones, because it's a very clear message, and I think it should be somehow always in the mind of the regulators as well as the assessors that, come on, it might impact a huge community.
Very quick, because I see our time. I'm a real believer in placing patients with lived experience in front of policymakers, in particular members of parliament, because patients are their constituents. I think the UK is doing better than other countries, so Steve and other people with experience in the UK can lead the way. I think other countries have less of a culture of, open pluralist democracy where you can just knock on the door. So I would really encourage this. I've seen it happen in other therapeutic areas, and it's so powerful. It just does lead to changing decisions.
So I do want to really just thank our panelists, the wonderful information, advice, and guidance that we've received from each of our panelists. I think it's clear that your lived experience as a patient, as a carer, representing the PF community within your national patient organizations, as members of EUPFF, really in the next several years with the robust pipeline of medicines that are being researched and developed for pulmonary fibrosis, it's a very, very exciting time. But it's also a short time for everyone to work together, be cohesive in the narrative to ensure that regulators and policymakers do their best to ensure that medicines developed for pulmonary fibrosis are available to everyone in the community. So with that, I would really like to just thank everyone and encourage you to look at the resources on the EUPFF website on how to engage in the HTA process with policymakers, regulators, and really work together. And I think the first step is coming to events like this. Great. Thank you. Thanks, great job.